Welcome everyone to our first program of 2024. Thanks for joining us tonight on our new night, Thursday. The weather played a little trick on us this week, so thanks for bearing with us as we switch to online only from the hybrid setup. Next month, we'll try and do the hybrid in-person online setup, so plan for that in February. I just want to draw your attention to a few things on the calendar on your screen. We have a work party coming up at the Native Plant Demonstration Garden in Edmonds on Martin Luther King Day. That'll be just a couple hours to help clean up the garden a little bit and get it ready for spring. If you're interested in volunteering for that, feel free to shoot me an email and I'll connect you with the right folks. We have several classes lined up for this spring. The first one is beginning birding. So if you're newer to birding and want to learn a little bit more about it, that's a perfect class for you. That's coming up starting next week. We have an owl class coming up in February and March, I should say, taught by Connie Seidels, and her classes are always wonderful. And we have a birding by ear class in March. It'll be 2-night class online, but then there's also an optional field trip if you're interested in applying some of those skills out in the field. And then we have a couple other festivals and events coming up that we could use some volunteer help with. One is the Arlington Eagle Festival coming up on February 3rd. For that, we need volunteers to help man our Project Audubon table, talk to people about birds, answer questions, hand out brochures, things like that. The Stanwood Snow Goose Festival is returning this year. That'll be February 24th. This is exciting because we haven't had that since 2020, I believe, right before the pandemic. So glad to have that one back. And the Snohomish Conservation District plant sale, we're trying to have a table there as well. And so if you're able to spend a couple hours at the Pilchuck Audubon table for any of those events, please reach out to me. We could always use help, whether it's an hour or half a day or whatever you can give us. I also want to mention, if you haven't heard about it, I will stop sharing my screen now so you can see me a little better. Our brand new birding in Snohomish County book is kind of blurred out with my background, but this came out in December. If you haven't ordered yours, encourage you to get that today. They're going fast, and it's basically highlights a bunch of the really great birding sites around the county, and we also included some Camano Island locations as well in this edition. So if you're interested in that, you can find it on our website, and I'll put the link in the chat in a little bit. And that's kind of all I have for announcements. And so I'm excited for our speaker tonight, Kyle Spragens. He's the Waterfowl Section Manager for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and he's here to talk about some of the cool information they're finding through some of their marking and telemetry projects. And so with that, Kyle, I'll go ahead and let you take it away.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it, and certainly appreciate the ability to present. Sorry it didn't work out in person. I was about halfway up and then turned around. so maybe next time, but certainly excited to present a little bit about some of the ongoings in the waterfowl section. In fact, this is the first presentation where I've actually specifically focused on only our sort of marking aspects of what's going on out there. And while I see a few familiar names on the call, I don't know a lot of you. So yeah, my name is Kyle Spragens. I work for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife as the Waterfowl Section Manager. I have sort of the responsibilities over waterfowl and the other migratory game birds, those that have a federal nexus throughout the state. I have an army of biologists scattered around the state that get to actually do the fun work, everything that I'm about to present about. Every once in a while, I get to still get back to the field, but not as much as I once did. So I certainly encourage along the way, because I am going to talk about several recent projects, some that are still ongoing, but most have happened only in the last 5-ish years, 7 years, maybe in a couple cases. So please, as I go, if you have questions, feel free to ask. I've tried to set up my screen so that I could see that a little bit more easily. So we'll see if I can get this to work. So let me see if I can share right screen. All right. Hopefully. Are you seeing, Brian, the main
Yeah,
slide?
I see the title slide. Yep.
Great, title slide. Perfect. Okay, so yeah, so like I said, gonna focus on some of the insights from our banding and telemetry work that we have going on. But before I get there, yeah, just a little bit more about who is the Waterfowl Section. While I work for the state now, my road and path to get here has included about 10 years of federal service between the USGS and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I worked for USGS down in San Francisco Bay on a variety of sort of wetland related projects, but perhaps the most pertinent to this discussion topic tonight is the work on marking birds in various countries in Asia related to concerns over avian influenza. Of course, this was during around the sort of 2005-2008 time period when avian influenza was just sort of rearing as a topic in East Asia. Ironic now that we're talking about avian influenza finally having gotten into North America after all the preparation and all the types of projects, marking projects, in this case of pintail and Eurasian widgeon out of Hong Kong that I was able to be involved in. But that certainly was a big part of my spurring my interest in marking projects, these migratory connectivity, sort of understanding of where birds are reliant upon, not only for where we see them in our own backyard, but from breeding to winter and everything in between. The sort of obligation to complete that annual life cycle is dependent on having those habitats being there in between. And that's true no matter where you are in the globe. For about 3 years, I was up on the Yukon Delta National Wildlife Refuge in Western Alaska. At that time, there was a big project marking cackling geese, minimas, the smallest cackling goose that largely winters in the Willamette Valley and the southwest 5 counties of Washington. There was a marking project trying to get at a better population estimate of those geese. But every day that I would walk into my office, the poster on the left is what would stare at me. Who cares about the geese? And the poster claims everyone. I hope everyone cares about the geese because there's some cool storylines with those birds. But oftentimes these birds that are starting from far away, you kind of lose the sort of detail in the stories about what it is that actually allows them to get from Alaska down to Washington. And of course, those of you that are looking at the flock of birds in the pen, you'll notice that there's not only cackling geese in there, there's a few white fronts in the back, and then of course some emperors in the front. Where those birds wind up from on the breeding grounds is just as varied as if we started marking them down here on the winter or spring staging areas and seeing where they wind up going. So that marking, those types of marking efforts up on the YK Delta are massive undertakings. The amount of time and logistic support and effort and certainly funding to put a crew of 20 plus biologists out in a remote field camp and pull off trying to mark 2,000 geese is not trivial. But that information only is possible because of the sort of support around monitoring and actually understanding some of the status. Of course, in the case of waterfowl, we benefit from the fact that they're big enough that we can actually play with some different marking types. I openly admit that is one of the reasons that waterfowl has always been an attractive study system for me, is because you get to play with some of the different marking techniques that are available. That took a even deeper step. I went back to the USGS following that stint of marking geese and getting to play with spectacled eiders and banding a bunch of ducks up on the YK Delta. And I was getting ready before this job to go back to graduate school to focus on canvasback. Had been a lot of marking of diving ducks, especially in San Francisco Bay, where that USGS office was back in the 80s, but a lot of that was related to contaminant work. And they didn't need sort of the high resolution data that a lot of the questions that people want to ask about habitat use and what are those habitats that some of these birds are actually targeting requires. The ability to get a handful of VHF telemetry points on something like a SCOP in retrospect now is silly. Like the amount of effort that had to go into getting that type of data. We are in a very exciting period where there are much more advancements in technology that are allowing us to get at some of that higher quality data. And this was an attempt at the time to try and wrestle with this. How do you get GPS quality data, really high resolution, not just that the point is in Washington, but that the point is in a particular pond or field of Washington. And so all this has sort of driven this. What are the appropriate ways of marking birds? What are those questions that we're really trying to get after? And all of that in the waterfowl world really depends on the type of species that you're dealing with. Are you dealing with more terrestrial geese, or are you dealing with something like a diving duck or a sea duck? It's not me alone. I've already said that, but certainly to be able to pull off this type of work in Washington takes a huge effort. I'm fortunate to have 3 permanent staff, Joe Evenson up in Bellingham, Matt Wilson over in Yakima, and Matt Hamer, who's down here in Olympia, where I'm stationed. But they're running around doing a whole host of projects, from surveys, including our breeding pair work, where it's aerial transects with helicopters in late April, early May on both sides of the state. What we refer to as PSAMP, that picture of the float plane of Kenmores in the background. Since the early 90s, there's been an aerial crew that during the wintertime fly 4,000 miles of transects of the Puget Sound to get at status and trends of sea ducks and other marine birds. That's wholly hosted out of the waterfowl section. And then, of course, marking. We have sort of devoted marking, or what we call operational banding up towards mallard, Canada goose, and dove. And then there's other projects that we are able to get into. That is what I'll focus on here more about, sort of more detailed marking projects. Other assessments that go on in the background related to sort of harvest monitoring and working with our flyway partners as part of this bigger flyway management realm of migratory birds. So what do I mean by that? Oftentimes folks don't realize that there are definitions in the federal world, right? The ultimate authority for migratory birds lies with the federal government because of treaties signed with 4 different countries: Canada, or Great Britain at the time of its signing, Mexico, Russia, and Japan. In the case of waterfowl, I have direct ties to all 4 of those treaties. And obviously, as your logo bird, with the snow geese, you have direct ties to Wrangel Island, Russia. All the birds that are wintering or passing through the Skagit and Stillaguamish Delta during the fall and winter time are all tied to Wrangel Island, Russia, which is a treaty signatory. But that's formalized. In those treaties, there were certain family groups that were called out as possible game birds. They're called out at the family level, and I'm not going to go too into detail about this, but this is why there's a differentiation between management and sort of the responsibilities of who is asked to do these monitoring activities. And the 5 families that you see listed there are what are in the Code of Federal Register of regulations related to what are classified as migratory game birds. While we don't hunt things like cranes in Washington, cranes are a harvestable species elsewhere. And so because of that, that's sort of this tie. So there's this group of birds that forces this tighter coordination between states, federal, and international governments in relation to monitoring and some of those broader, bigger research projects that we attempt to go after. So that bigger network of support, the reason that it's so tilted towards waterfowl is because you're talking about a lot of species of individual species. In Washington, if you stack up the ducks and the geese and the swans and you think of it in species or populations in the parentheses, we're talking about easily 35 different species, not thinking about vagrants or anything like that. I am counting Eurasian widgeon, but that's just because they are so predictable. But in terms of geese, these populations and swans, the populations of sort of known starting breeding area and sort of where they concentrate in the wintertime, that is our obligation. And then there's those other 4 species: coot, snipe, fantail pigeon, and mourning dove. So those are the ones that my shop, Waterfowl Section, and the other migratory game birds that we are charged with monitoring in various ways. And in the events that we have enough sort of support and funding and that sort of ability to go deeper, ask those deeper questions, that's where sort of being able to go into these marking, the more elaborate marking projects is so important. So the treaties, the formal sort of go-between in terms of that state, federal, and international is what is referred to as the Flyway Councils. We are part of the Pacific Flyway Council. I serve on behalf of the agency as our technical liaison to the Pacific Flyway Study Committee. I have an equivalent that serves on the non-game side, which is those that are having to deal with things like eagle and raptor regulations, cormorant discussions, everything that is not a harvestable species that still has some sort of regulatory or permit tie to it with the federal government. Our council member is Eric Gardner. He is the wildlife program lead for the department. And so the 3 of us are the ones that are having to go to these typically 2 or 3 times a year meetings throughout the Pacific Flyway states, all those states west of the Rocky Mountains, to go through all this and to develop projects that might help us get better information to influence habitat and allow us to manage better, basically. I will point out that last piece about partnerships. There's no way that we could pull this off without broad partnerships. And I will touch on a couple of these to kind of illustrate like how important that is. But the ability to pull these types of projects off are no small feat. So with that, I'm going to launch into sort of the actual marking exciting part. As I mentioned, we do some very basic sort of the basic entry point of marking studies, and that's with banding. Recognizing that because of that federal tie, to be able to mark any migratory bird, you have to have a federal bird banding lab permit, right? The department has had one since 1946, continuously since 1946. It's largely been carried because of the waterfowl, but there are obviously other birds that we as a department have marked. For example, one of the studies that I won't talk about, but certainly is under our permit, is with red knots out in Grays Harbor. My former Flyway colleague, Joe Buchanan, has long been the lead on that work out of Grays Harbor with red knots. But all that banding is done under the same station permit that I oversee for the department. That is what we have to have to ban things like Western Canada geese in that slide in the figure on the left. Those are all the harvest recoveries of Western Canada geese marked in Washington. While a lot of people think that Western Canada geese don't move very far, they often call them resident geese. Yeah, kind of, except for not that resident. There are some funny storylines that go on in the background with Western Canada geese. And while those that are in the western side of the state may not have been naturally there, everything in the Columbia Basin actually absolutely was, and everything down the Columbia to the Columbia River mouth was. There's a big molt movement of birds, and that's what we pick up in Canada. The slide on the figure on the right is harvest recovery for something like mourning dove. We are absolutely a breeding area for mourning dove, but our mourning dove are boogieing out of here as fast as they can, unless the weather allows them to stay up here. And so not surprisingly, we see recoveries all the way down into, Mexico, Central America. So that's sort of this, these are these operational bandings. We mark about 1,000 Western Canada geese a year, about 800 to 1,000 mourning dove a year, and greater than 2,000 mallard every year, because we have to keep tabs on the harvest side of the equation for those specific birds. Those are big harvest items in this state. But all the other banding, for any other species that might come up or any other time of the year, all of these birds that I mentioned, these 3 species, are all marked pre-season. So Canada geese is typically June, July. Mourning dove is July. Mallard is all August, September time periods. Anything outside of that time period, like if we're marking birds that we're trying to get spring migration tracks on, those are all tied to some sort of larger cooperative effort, because that sort of underlying information is honed in on a specific question. So to get those sample sizes up, there's no way that we could do it alone. And while obviously I focused on harvest recovery in those 2 maps, that's not the only way that encounter comes back to us. This is an outrageous example of a former National Wildlife Refuge employee who belly crawled out on the Oregon coast, just up from Bandon, and belly crawled up, took 419 photos to get the full band read for me on this mallard that was marked in just north of Ephrata, Washington, but was molting. You can see sort of the fresh primaries just growing in, was molting out on the Pacific Ocean several years later. So in all cases, any kind of encounter is the type of information that we hope gets reported to the national database, reportband.gov, whether you take it with through harvest or you're able to encounter through live recapture during like our banding operations, or you're able to actually read the federal band with a series of photos. All of that could get reported, and all of that comes back to the master bander permit to allow us to know, hey, by the way, you got a ping at this time of the year with all this information. And of course, there's much more complex ways of using sort of other markers like the neck collars, the photo of the cacklers, in this case, dusky Canada geese, that are important tools in trying to get at something like population size. There's games that we can play with the ratios of marked to unmarked individuals during these survey operations that we do through the fall and winter, sometimes into the spring, that allow us to correct and say, okay, well, now that we know that, we have an idea of how big this population. Because some of these remote areas, you can't get an airplane up there or a helicopter up there long enough to actually get a good population estimate. You might be able to get an index, sort of a feeling of how is this group of birds doing, but to cover a full area, to get to a census, is just not realistic in many cases. And so there are techniques that we can utilize through marking to allow us to correct some sort of known marked population up to a full population estimate. Okay, so, but that's not the type of questions that a lot of people want to ask. A lot of people are wanting to ask, including myself, are, what are these areas that these birds are so dependent on? What is the type of habitat that is actually what we should be trying to influence? And maybe more importantly, or at least more in my interest realm, is when is that habitat needing to be there? And where is the actual spot on the ground that we have the potential to pull something like that off? Migratory birds, I'm telling people that probably are very aware of this. Migratory birds are not birds that are reliant on one place on the map for the entire annual life cycle. They have to move from breeding areas to wintering areas, sometimes very far apart from each other. And in many cases, they're hoping for sort of food to be there along the way. And so those types of questions, when you're drifting more into habitat population or habitat use or sort of migration chronology and sort of that availability side of the habitat questions, that is when we invoke telemetry projects. There's other cases where we've invoked telemetry projects for just pure delineation. We might know that we have a bird that winters in our area or breeds in our area, but we might not know where the terminus on the other side of their range really is. And so trying to get some of that fundamental sort of natural history information of knowing, do we need to be worried about things going on in the boreal or down in Central America or on the coast more than what we're thinking? That type of information is also sort of where we would lean on sort of telemetry projects. So this list of projects, I'm going to touch on quite a few of these, some of them real quickly, others I'll kind of go into a little bit more. But these are the projects that have basically occurred or been revisited since I started in 2016 for the department. Most of these, probably most folks are not aware of that we have been conducting. Some of these maybe you're aware of or have heard little bits about, like with some of the work with snow geese. But I bet there's some insights that I'm going to show little tidbits of that maybe you aren't aware of. I'm not going to go exactly in this order. I'm going to start with snow geese to kind of, because obviously that's a relevant topic for what you all are interested in, and we'll go from there. And Brian, if you see some question in the chat, I'm having a hard time seeing the chat. I could see hands if they raise or something like that, but I can't quite follow the chat. So by all means, interrupt me if something comes up. Okay, so as I mentioned, most folks on this call are well aware that your snow geese breed on a tiny little island off of Siberia known as Wrangel Island. That connection with Wrangel Island, Russia, we benefited from for many, many decades. The longtime researcher Vasily Baranyuk being sort of a dedicated researcher that would get dumped out on Wrangel Island, get to see the breeding side of things, sometimes come over to Washington during the wintertime and chase these birds around. That was very much the cycle of things in the 90s. Like that was sort of a no-brainer. All the snow goose camps in the Arctic really kind of got revved back up in the 90s. And so there was sort of this suite of snow goose focused research camps across the Arctic. And Vazi was the Wrangel Island contact. Of course, times have changed. All sorts of weird things are going on with birds and food. And more problematically, global politics and iffy relationships, right? So unfortunately, I haven't been allowed to be able to sort of have direct contact with Vasily, and more problematic, the federal government's not allowed to, right? To my knowledge, Vasily has not been allowed to be out on Wrangel Island for the last 2 summers, but I don't know that for certain. So after having come off of this wealth of insights from the breeding grounds, how do we tackle information on a place that we cannot see? Especially when we know there's a lot of changes going on. And one of those changes was the fact that this map that's in the sort of lower left of the screen was the sort of picture, the mental model of how the Wrangel Island population was moving from Wrangel Island down into the wintering grounds and that distribution during the wintertime. So at that time, the best understanding was 90% of the population came down the coast, hit the YK Delta on its way through the Fraser-Skagit, and a big chunk of those birds wound up down in California. But actually 60% would winter in the Skagit-Fraser. Meanwhile, something like 10% maybe curled in towards Alberta, and most of those birds, as far as anybody understood, made their way down to the California Central Valley. That's great. That's a great sort of baseline. What's that model? That is not even close to what is going on in today's world. in general, yes, those movement patterns are correct. But now the movement into Alberta during the fall time is the majority of Wrangell Island birds. At best, my best figure of what proportion of the population actually winters in the Fraser Skagit at the time of this document, it said 60%. If it's 15% of the entire population, I'd be shocked. And I say that because what people see on the ground has been, other than this year, forget about this year for a second, has been a big boom in the number of birds that are actually holding up there, right? Our counts peaked at about 130,000 wintering birds in the Fraser Skagit flock. That's insane. That's a huge number. But what we knew was starting to happen was there was this buildup of birds over in the Columbia Basin. So we started while we've been monitoring birds in the Fraser Skagit, we do a count with a photo flight. We actually fly it, take photos, throw it through a processing, sort of a photo post-processing component, because trying to count flocks of 40,000 snow geese is not accurate. Nobody can do it accurately. I don't care what they say. That's not possible. And now we have data to sort of prove that. But that's not the bulk of the birds anymore. And more problematic, we were hearing that there was this buildup of birds happening, starting to occur over in the Columbia Basin, but we knew nothing about what those birds were. Vasily did release a handful of transmitters that were paid for by California, Washington, Canadian Wildlife Service chipped in for a few of them, to try and document sort of what is this sort of movement pattern now. And this is what happened. The vast majority of the birds that he marked up on Wrangell Island, only one of the 10 or 12 that he marked that summer actually stayed in the Fraser Skagit for the winter. The bulk of them went down in the Central Valley, California. And when those birds are in California for the winter, the Wrangell Island birds, they do not come back through Washington. They curl over to the Oregon-Idaho border. Sometimes they stop in Montana, but that's not always every year. They go up into Alberta and then they curl back around up to Wrangell Island that way. Our birds, meanwhile, the ones that are wintering in Washington, most up in the Skagit Fraser will head back up the coast on their way to Wrangell Island, but not all. Some of them are hopping over the mountains and going into Alberta. This had major influence over the sort of the harvest regulation side of the world. But I want folks to think about this for a second, because that type of growth that was seen in the Skagit wasn't because of native foods, right? This species is a perfect example of why geese and swans have been on a very different trajectory in their population growth than something like ducks, and especially something like sea ducks. This type of carex, the sort of the rooting around in the sedge and chomping on the tubers, that is sort of the native food. This is why it would have been a traditional wintering area. Wouldn't have been a lot of birds, but there would have absolutely been snow geese that wintered here. But that's not what they're after now, right? Potato fields, barley fields, corn, even silage cut corn, even though there's not a lot of grain sitting out there, that supplemental food is not something that we're putting out there on purpose, but it has major ramifications for why you see birds where they are and why you see as many as you do for as long as they're out there on the landscape. And so while the Fraser has been growing at the same time over in the Columbia Basin, we've been seeing massive increases, way greater rates of increase than what the Fraser Skagit has been seeing. And in fact, that group over in the Columbia Basin, there is now a wintering flock greater than the Fraser Skagit flock. That would not have been true. I would not have been able to say that 5 years ago. The question was, were they actually tied to Wrangell Island? Do they follow those same patterns? And so this was a release this last spring to try and tackle that question. We teamed up with a USGS group out of Dixon, California, who had been marking snow geese down in Central Valley. They sent up 12 transmitters, these GPS, GSM. All that means is GPS is really high quality data, really low error. And the GSM means it's talking to the cell tower. So as long as it's in cell range, it can dump data. In fact, with these transmitters, the one you see on the neck, you can actually, as long as it's in range, you can reset the collection commands, sort of the intervals, how frequently, how often is it trying to offload. And so that's what we did. We do have birds still online. I don't have that sort of map of their sort of return, but everything wound up back in the Columbia Basin, even though the majority of birds jumped over to Alberta on their way north. But at least 3 came down the coastal route, passed over Skagit-Fraser. Only one of those birds actually touched down, and then they crossed over the mountains and dumped back into the Columbia Basin. They are absolutely Wrangell Island birds over in the Columbia Basin. So why is that so important? Well, when we do counts, I mentioned the photo count, we are getting one snapshot in time. So let's say that bar, I mean, even though this is not about snow geese, that one bar represents what a count that we get is. But over the period of time that we expect birds to actually be in this zone, you're not talking about just sort of that one time snapshot of how many birds do you need to provide for. We know that Washington's a migratory state. We know that there's peaks that are not necessarily when we do our counts. And in fact, in those migration periods, even though we might have lower counts than a peak, you have more individuals passing through during that time period. But to try to count that, you would have to match the frequency of how fast birds are moving in and out of the system. And in some cases, that's a matter of days. There's no way that we could formalize some sort of survey. We've tried. We've played that game before. It's expensive. It's time consuming. But a better way to actually go after that is to mark a group of birds that start to paint this chronology picture for you to understand when is it that you actually have sort of these demands, higher demands at certain times, and sort of the overall length. It's a volume equation. It's not about how many birds do you see on any one day. It's about how many days do you have birds sitting in your area of requirement. And so that translates to this need for food. These birds, whether you're talking about ducks or geese or swans, all have some core minimum amount of calories that they have to consume in any given day just to make it break even. When you look at somewhere like the North Puget Lowlands, which I'm including something like Whatcom, Skagit, Snohomish, and running the Snoqualmie Valley up into King County, these are the types of demands that you would have. If you had a peak of 450,000 dabbling ducks during the wintertime, which we easily do, 130,000 snow geese, which we absolutely hit in past years, and something like 18,000 swans, the actual demand is the equivalent of more than 54 million ducks, 34 million ducks in the case of snow geese, and an additional 8.3 million ducks for the swans over the entirety of that season. The point is, you need a lot of food to actually support that kind of overwintering number of birds, let alone during those migration periods. And that's just in the North Puget Lowlands. Okay, so I'm going to shift. So I know that was a lot. Happy to answer any questions on that one. But this is, I'm trying to ground it in, why would we be marking these types of birds and asking these types of questions about where is the responsibility and how great is that responsibility that we have when it comes to habitat. It's one thing to say this habitat type is important. It's a different thing to say how much of that habitat do you need to support an anticipated number of birds for a period of time that you should know to expect. We know that we have birds from mid-August until early April that are not breeding here in the state. And actually, the vast majority of those birds are going up to places like Canada and Alaska or Wrangell Island, Russia. So how do we make sure that we're doing our job on this side of the equation? And that's part of that's part of those questions that we're trying to answer with this type of technique. Okay, total shift. This is the only non-waterfowl, but this one has actually been exciting. Bandtail pigeons, not my background. Waterfowl has been my background. I've even done some rail work and that kind of stuff, but bandtail pigeons, not something that I was anticipating getting involved with. But there was this question going on about, well, wait a minute, like when do these birds actually leave the state? Where are they actually winding up in the wintertime? I had heard everything from people thinking that they're sticking around to, sort of everything. Yeah, all sorts of bizarre hypotheses. Well, the only way that you actually answer that question is you mark some birds. We every July conduct what's called a mineral site survey. Bandtail pigeons are unique, particularly in this 10-day period in July. They are hyper focused on returning to some sort of mineral site. They're after calcium. They pick up salt, but they're after the calcium. But in Washington, they can do that in the marine environment. They hit tidal flats where there's sort of salt deposition concentrations, or they find some sort of spring, some sort of inland sort of concentrated mineral site. So we conduct those surveys, but again, that's an index. I have no idea how many total bandtail pigeons there are in the state. We don't have a marking method that allows us to make that extrapolation. But I have a very good idea of, okay, the population has been static for the last 20 years now. What we didn't have sort of a good information on was the birds up in the Olympic Peninsula. We have no known mineral sites that have been logged up there. And so some of the regional biologists out in those districts asked to be able to mark a handful of bandtail pigeons to see if we could actually get this technology to work. This again is a GPS GSM transmitter that's on the back of the bird in the picture. These ones are 9 grams. They're tiny to be GPS capable, really high precision. And when I say that, like a point is within 15 feet of reality. And there are GSM. So as long as they're in a cell network, they're going to be able to offload the data. If they aren't able to offload the data, they keep it on board and they just wait until they're back in cell service and then they offload. They can hold something like 10,000 points on board before they would have to bleed off points or stop collecting points. We've never hit that kind of overflow. And the two figures are just two examples of where some of these birds have shown us. The vast majority of our bandtail pigeons wind up in California. A big chunk of them wind up in the Eel River drainage up in Northwest California, sort of the Trinity's west to the Pacific Ocean. But in fact, in subsequent years, and we've marked 3 seasons in a row now, there are birds that wind up on the Sierra side, not over the ridge into Nevada, but on the California side. And this year, actually, several of them went further south, kind of inland from Santa Cruz, Monterey, and even further south than that. Whether that's weather driven, kind of weather pushing them down, or if it's food driven, bandtails are very berry oriented. Elderberry, cascara, madrone berries. That is what they target during this sort of fall winter time period. But they're not targeting that here. And the vast majority of them, while we do have breeders, and everyone that we marked attempted to breed in the state, they are out of the state by mid-September to late October. They're out of our sort of jurisdiction into Oregon or California. And right now there's a handful, about half a dozen that are online still in California. These transmitters, in 3 cases now, we have 3 birds that we have 3 full migration round trips for. Those 3 birds now have more than 20,000 GPS locations each, because that data is collecting at 45-minute intervals They turn off at night because bandtails go to a roost site, so you only need sort of the beginning and the end. We save the power so that we can sort of supercharge it and see where it is that they're going sort of during the daytime. And we have now found 6 mineral sites in the Olympic Peninsula zone that we've been able to actually get operationalized so that we can do those surveys to keep status checks on them. And there's no way we would have found those mineral sites without this sort of technology. One of them, in fact, one of them was just outside of Aberdeen. And when the biologists went there, there was more than 700 bandtails going to that mineral site, which makes it the first or second largest mineral site that we actually are aware of in Western Washington. So colleagues up in Canada, we've specifically been trying to target market our breeding birds here, but colleagues up in particularly on Vancouver Island have been very interested to know sort of the information, similar information, that sort of high habitat use, high quality data information for bandtails that are originating up in BC. To the best of our knowledge, the vast majority of birds are up in BC during the breeding season. But again, it's hard to get to sort of a population estimate. All right, total another shift. So I'm counting on you, Brian, if questions come at me. This one is sort of a total different tact. This is something that we refer to as the channeled scablands. So this is an Eastern Washington project. But the point of this project was to highlight these spring wetlands that are very ephemeral on the landscape. So ephemeral that they are in trouble of people not liking wet meadow staying there too long because it impedes sort of hay growth and that kind of stuff. But is there value? Well, obviously there's value. You know, one photo like this shows you how many birds actually will use those little wet meadows. But we teamed up with Gonzaga, Ducks Unlimited, Turnbull National Wildlife Refuge to mark a handful of female pintail to try to understand sort of this like connection between wetland complexes and where those birds are going to on their way north. We had more than 1,400 GPS locations of only 6 individual pintail that danced around the Turnbull wetlands. And what became very clear is, you know, when you go out and survey a pond, well, maybe you see 3 pintail every time. Well, from this data, it's very clear it's not the same 3 pintail every time. And that's that turnover concept. Just because you don't see more bird doesn't mean that they're not different birds, right? And so those individual female pintail during the spring, which is a super important period for building nutrients for the breeding season, they were using anywhere from 10 to 30 different wetland complexes, different wetland bodies to actually fulfill their sort of 3-week stay during the spring in the channeled scablands. That, from a sort of landscape conservation standpoint, is a very different tack than saying I only need to protect this pond because I counted pintail here. So that sort of network of sites, that concept. But even more, of course, we got sort of, where is the connectivity of these birds? Well, one of these females wound up on the YK Delta, attempted to breed, and then this red track is a 27-hour straight flight that the bird did from Western Alaska, the YK Delta, down to coastal Oregon. To pull off that flight, the bird would have had to average 77 kilometers an hour, which means it was hitting higher speeds than that, because that was just the sort of average. Quite the feat. And we did have a handful of actual crossing the ocean flight for that one female pintail. So some of the unique insights of where do some of these birds actually come from that we wouldn't have otherwise. And as I mentioned, this allows us to plug this type of information into sort of these wetland priority tools that are being developed by different habitat-oriented entities like the Intermountain West Joint Venture, to think about what are those series of those sort of collection of wetlands that are so important at different times of the year to fulfill annual life cycles of multiple species. All right, Harlequin duck, Classically, Harlequin duck has been marked in the Rocky Mountain realms. Glacier Park in Montana is sort of one of the sort of key marking sites that has long marked Harlequin duck. From a lot of those studies and earlier transmitter studies, we know that Harlequin provide a very unique storyline. They are mountain nesters, but they are coastal dependent for the wintering time. But that sort of spread, if you start from one breeding site, how dispersed is the wintering population? Hard to get at unless you mark multiple individuals from one site. And even though those tarsal bands, like the blue one from Glacier Park, are helpful and you can see them, to actually recite all of the marked birds from a deployment like that is damn near impossible, because they wind up in places that you just literally logistically can't get to. But transmitters allow us to go in blind, basically. We get that information at some point without having to see the bird, right? And so that has helped us kind of gain that better understanding of what's the movement patterns of this bird. But we had very little information about our own birds in the Cascades. The bulk of the population probably nests in the Rockies, but we had very limited knowledge about sort of, well, what's the tendency in these sort of Cascade birds. We were fortunate to mark 18 males. We focus on males because we're trying not to compromise anything in the breeding cycle of the females. These are internal implants for sea ducks, because if you put something external on a sea duck, a diving duck, it has problems with sort of compromising their ability to dive. But the internal implants don't have that same problem. We rely on some incredibly well-trained veterinarians that have done hundreds of individual implants to do this type of work, so that we can get the insights that, like you see in that figure with the red dots, that's where the scattering of males marked in rivers that drain into the Salish Sea, both on the Cascade and the Olympic side of Washington, that's where they wound up scattering to molt, right? So waterfowl are unique because they go through synchronous molt. Well, Harlequin have the unique storyline of males, after the female starts initiation of wherever the nest is, all come back to the salt to molt. They don't stay in the freshwater system. They come back to the saltwater system, molt, go flightless for 45 plus days, and then at some point they meet back up with the female later on in the wintertime. But we had birds all the way up to Southeast Alaska, up by Haines, and we actually had one bird, the furthest south, was down by Crescent City, California, Castle Rock. One of them molted down in that far south, but everything in between, right? So that's sort of, where does a breeding origin wind up? Sometimes you get birds that are very keyed into geographically similar areas, and other times you get this sort of dispersal effect. Uniquely, we had one sort of direct example of this, where we had a female that we had caught with the male. So the unique aspect of the Harlequins is we drape a mist net across the river, not in the water, but above the river. That allows us to actually, in most cases, capture the pair. We implant the male, we put the identifier on the female. And in this case, her male, at the time of this picture, the ducklings being hatched out, was one of those birds up in Southeast Alaska. Same time period, right? And so the requirements to fulfill annual life cycle can differ by sex, not just species. And so understanding sort of that type of life history strategy is something that differentiates things like sea ducks from dabbling ducks. That has to be taken into account. But how do you get at that unless you have ways to observe those individuals? But even though they might have sort of this, the overall breeding population might disperse, individuals have very high fidelity to the zone. And so this is a male in two different cycles of where he used went back to the same breeding stream, went out to the same molting point out by Nia Bay, used some spot sort of along the way, but not for very long up by Nanaimo. That's probably during the herring spawn, because that's sort of a key piece of the harlequin cycle. So they have very high fidelity to the sites they choose, but across individuals from the same stream, there's going to be dispersal across a broader landscape. Scoters, another sea duck, was a group of birds that we actually, the department did a lot of work between 2005 and 2008. There was, that was sort of the pulse of those implants, those implant transmitters coming out. But those implant transmitters are not as precise. The error around each point is much greater than 15 feet. It's more like 100 meters at best. But that's enough to get you delineation information and sort of migration chronology, but it's not enough to hone in on sort of the questions related to where are birds using explicitly in something like the Salish Sea. However, one of the most important outcomes of that project, which was a team effort between groups up in Canada, Washington, and down in San Francisco Bay, and actually a handful that were deployed down in Mexico, was what this figure shows, is that from that study, they suddenly realized that a bunch of the scoters who are boreal nesters, surf scoters go up to the boreal forest, white wings a little bit more just on the edge of the boreal forest, but a large number of them come back to the Salish Sea or even the outer coast and molt. They do their flightless period, much like the harlequins, out on our waters. They don't do that on the big lakes up in the boreal forest. They come back here. So every one of these dots, and the dots are related to the winter area that they were marked, is a molting location that was observed during that study. When they followed up and did direct counts, I mean, we're talking about, in some cases, 5,000 to 10,000 molting scoters that are in some of these sub-bays at that time. And that is a very important nuance when you start talking with some of the oil response teams, because when they think about what would they do in the case of an oil spill response, they weren't necessarily thinking of it from a time period matter standpoint, other than sort of sheer numbers of birds that they might encounter. But if your tact is to deter a bunch of birds off of the water when an oil spill happens, yet 10,000 of those birds are flightless in August, you're going to have a problem. So they've actually started to infuse that in their oil spill response exercises that they do, that there's a specific time component into those exercises that triggers a different, sort of consideration. That type of information, again, it's like, well, yeah, you see molting birds every once in a while, but to understand the distribution of those sites and sort of the magnitude, unless you know where to look, that's a lot of coastline to go try and hope that you find the needle in the haystack, right? So that was a very important insight. And it allowed us to see the sort of timing piece. Any of these bars in August are time periods of potential molt. Padilla Bay in particular was an area that had really high numbers, up to 8,000 individual scoters in Padilla Bay molting at the time of this study, as opposed to somewhere like Penn Cove or Birch Bay. And why? Because of food resource. If you don't have the big lush eelgrass beds, then you're not going to have sort of protection and sort of more reliable food resources during that molt period, which are critical and very important in that feather regrowth, right? Food equals energy, energy equals everything that those birds have to do throughout their annual life cycle. And in this case, regrowing flight feathers. But with concerns over increased vessel traffic, or even some of those oil spill type ideas, trying to understand how something like a surf scoter or white-winged scoter is using the Salish Sea is a whole different level of question. You need more precise information. You need better sample sizes. So over the last 2 years, Canadian Wildlife Service partner and WDFW was able to get funds from the Sea Duck joint venture to mark what wound up being about 65 surf scoters and 33 white-winged scoters with implant transmitters that now are GPS capable. And so not only are we able to see sort of where our birds, actively transmitting from, we were able to get sort of these, what's the route of something like male surf scoters once they leave the Salish Sea. But more importantly, we were able to get incredibly high definition information about surf scoters during the winter, and more importantly, the spring spawning period of herring spawn. Scoters, particularly surf scoters, are highly reliant on herring eggs for protein acquisition that goes directly into egg formation in certain cases. And so understanding sort of this, like, well, when are they there, and how much of that marked population is actually concentrating? When do they move to some of the spawns, like off of Hornby and Denman? In several cases, we had birds that actually moved to those locations prior to the official herring spawn call that was coming from the agencies. And so that type of insight is amazing, right? Like, this opens up a whole different world. And for us, this was particularly important to team up with the Canadian Wildlife Service to show this transboundary obligation. Birds don't care about our artificial boundaries, right? We know that, but the ability to actually unify the data sets across our international lines are not as easy as you would think. And so by using the birds to help us crosswalk some of the underlying spatial layers like bathymetry and some of the sort of substrate type data that's available out there, huge. And so there's a huge component with Birds Canada who have focused on that sort of GIS angle. It's opened up a relationship with the University of Washington Co-op Research Unit, who's focusing on helping us translate some of our information into sort of these habitat association models to look at those relationships, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of that habitat type that drives why you see certain species in certain areas and not in others, right? That type of detailed information has been incredibly hard to get at until this recent development in being able to equip implants with GPS capability. All right, couple last ones. These ones I'll go through for fairly quickly because there's still sort of ongoing activities. But while I was up on the Yukon Delta, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife started marking what some people refer to as small Canada geese, which is usually a mixture of Tavner's cackling geese and lesser Canada geese. Those two subspecies have been notoriously hard to monitor because they are not in sort of the high density nesting areas that are classically surveyed on places like the YK Delta and other parts of Alaska. However, they have very predictable movements. And so this initial set of Tavners and Lessers that were marked by the department was a helpful insight. But again, we never had sort of sample sizes that allowed us to get at information that that was really useful. It allowed us to see, oh, hey, they're using some of these oxbow rivers up in Alaska, but only having 8 marked birds doesn't really give us enough of an insight. I mentioned that sort of concentrated area of nesting. The classic 4 geese up on the YK Delta of black brant, cackling goose, the minimas, emperor geese, and greater white-fronted geese, the Pacific type, they are hyper concentrated along the coastal zone, particularly of the central coast of the YK Delta. But things like Tavners and Lessers are nowhere in that map. They're in the gray areas of that map. The density is so low that it's hard. These are showing sort of the nesting densities of these geese. Yeah, Tavners and Lessers don't show up that way. So for us, it's been a real troubleshooting of how do we get better information on this bird that we just can't round up and do banding, and we can't do aerial surveys very well. And more problematic was there is a group of birds that nest up on the North Slope that are called Tavner's cackling geese. And in the Pacific Flyway, we were pretty sure that's not true, that they shouldn't be classified as taverners, but we didn't have anything to prove it because of all those things I just mentioned. It's hard to ban them. We teamed up with Alaska thanks to funds from the Arctic Goose Joint Venture, which focuses on goose research. Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife chipped in. The ANWR, Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, was a big partner in that. We were able to send teams up to the North Slope, capture nesting hens of these taverners, cackling geese. I think we wound up in something like the neighborhood of about 75 individual marked nesting cackling geese up there. None of them have come into the Pacific Flyway. They've all gone down the eastern front of the Rocky Mountains and into places like Denver and Albuquerque and panhandle of Texas and Oklahoma, Playa Lakes regions. They are not Pacific Flyway birds. They nest in Alaska. Alaska has obligations, but they do not come down into the areas that we have management authority over. So we needed to do the other side. So this last spring, two crack shot biologists from Alaska Department of Fish and Game came down to help two of our members do rocket nets, trying to target taverners and lessers across the Columbia Basin. They focused on McNary, but McNary National Wildlife Refuge, but they actually used several sites. And they were able to deploy a good number on our side. And in the meantime, Alaska has been deploying more on their side to try and get at this. Are there some points that we could actually focus on trying to capture volumes of birds to play that game of trying to ramp up to a population estimate? Or can we put out these transmitters in areas that we know that we're concerned about, sort of what is the actual habitat availability for them? And so I think online right now is something like 50 to 60 marked taverners and lessers combined, kind of a mixture. Over on the Columbia Basin side, there's a few that are down in the Willamette Valley, but those are birds that they marked elsewhere in Alaska. And so this is an ongoing project. The Alaska folks are going to come back down this spring, and we'll start having better information, hopefully, about those taverners and lessers. And while we're focused on the Columbia Basin side, we know that there's been a change in sort of the presence of cackling geese in more northern parts of Western Washington. We've talked about that. I don't know if that will be on this year's cycle of trying to target, understanding where those birds are associated with, but Alaska is kind of the leader of this project, and we are sort of the technical logistical support. So an exciting partnership, and certainly some awesome insights that we're getting from that. All right, final one. Hopefully you're getting the idea that we are doing a lot of marketing projects right now. Okay, so any guesses of what these dots might represent? I can't see the chat. I still can't see the chat, Brian.
No guesses so far.
Okay, well, it's only two birds, so it was a little bit of a trick. Two birds, about 1,000 locations each, GPS locations, and only pretty much during September. all in the title flats. It's a male and a female mallard. They're not a pair, just happens to be they were marked in the same area. But this is what mallards do in September. And why? Why would there be dabbling ducks like mallards out on the tidal side in September? And this is sort of an image that illustrates sort of like, yeah, and it's not just mallards, there's a bunch of other dabbling ducks. Because there's no water on the inland side that would really provide forage availability. And so this idea of, yeah, you could put food out on the landscape, but can they actually get to it? Is it of value? Can they access it? Can they even try? And whether that's a disturbance pressure, whether that's something like harvest or eagles or whatever you want to call a disturbance pressure, or something like the fact that they can't eat if there's not water on the landscape. They literally can't digest the food if it's not wet. There has to be a moisture content to it. And so this tidal environment is incredibly important during the early fall. But during the wintertime, while they sit out on the bays, that's not what they're not foraging on the bays. They're going into that inland side. And so that trying to tease apart this relationship of movements on the tidal versus the inland side is something that has been very hard to get at because it's incredibly nuanced. You have to have really high interval collection, and you have to have very precise data collection of individuals, like point precision, to actually try to unravel that sort of what does that look like. So we've started to take a little bit of a stab at that one. But the reason for that over in the 4 main bays in your zone of interest is because we have a huge wintering population of dabbling ducks. It varies from year to year, having to do with winter conditions and how cold is it? Is there actually available water? But in 2006, through aerial surveys, our highest count, which was a cold snap year, right? So a bunch of birds got shoved down into our zone. We were talking about just shy of 1 million wintering dabbling ducks that were counted during that survey period. It'll be really interesting to see what happens during this cold snap that's about to hit us, because that availability is about to crunch in some inland and more northern estuaries, because if there's not open water, there's not availability, whether it's dry or frozen, right? And so this game about food and sort of that seasonal aspect of when do waterfowl need those different habitats out there? What is it that the type of food that they're actually trying to target at those different times of the year? All are pieces of the puzzle that we try to solve using these more elaborate marking techniques. We try to partner and use these as tools to work with others. In fact, those 2 mallards that were marked in Port Susan Bay were only because of a partnership with the Stillaguamish tribe, who has started to mark preseason duck banding, doing that preseason mallard marking with us. And we've been exploring the ability of like, hey, what could we actually learn in some of these systems that we've had a hard time understanding? The Stillaguamish tribe are also responsible for the 6 Motus towers that are up in that zone now, funded by funds that they've chased down in support of their council, right? And so that's sort of who is doing these marking studies, while certainly long it's been the agencies kind of shouldering at least the waterfowl side of that. It's not just us, right? I mean, it is a huge partnership to pull off these types of flyway coordinated efforts, these local focused efforts to understand some of that habitat use and need and demand, the requirements, and sort of balancing in between those is where sort of our shop continues to try to push forward and develop these types of projects, but more importantly, working with partners and finding folks that want to come out and mark some birds, even if it is just a Canada goose, right? We welcome those types of opportunities. It's often hard to make things work together to get folks out and directly involved, but there are opportunities like that. And so I'll leave my sort of contact information there as sort of the end piece of that. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the waterfowl section and some of the work that we're doing in the state, and hopefully maybe you realize that we're doing a little bit more than just sort of hunting regulation work out there. And we welcome future partnerships with this group and folks that are individuals, so are interested and have those questions. So happy to take any questions. I'll stay on for a little while and do my best to answer them.
Thanks, Kyle. That was fascinating and very informative. We do have a few questions in the chat now. Right. First one is, how are the kilocalories information for ducks, geese, and swans used by WDFW?
Well, we're kind of in the middle of that game. The kilocalorie information is sort of a game that those habitat joint ventures, so on the west side of the state, Pacific Bird Habitat Joint Venture, it's a way of trying to step population numbers down into what's an anticipated amount of food that's required. And then how much acreage do you need to be able to pull off that amount of food? The reality is we don't grow the majority of the food demand that waterfowl rely upon. That is all, the vast majority of that is coming from sort of incidental benefit from what I would call the working land side, the agricultural land side. And not everybody's happy about that, right? Farmers are not thrilled that of seeing white birds, whether it's snow geese or swans out in their fields. And so trying to reframe the what is the right type of food for us to be trying to focus on, because we only have so many acres to provide that, is a difficult conversation. And the only way to kind of formulate that is to put it in this terms of currency, and the bottom line currency is calories. Birds have to have calories. If you expect so many birds to be here for a certain amount of time, then we have an obligation to try to ensure that that system has X amount of calories over X amount of acres. So we're playing that game. We work with our partners like Ducks Unlimited. We work with, we have a graduate student doing the Trumpeter Swan project right now, in that same thread of trying to understand that, how much food would be expected if you have that many trumpeter swans. And so we're getting there. We're developing that more. It's sort of this bioenergetic side of waterfowl world that is important, but it's a different way of kind of thinking about the problem statement.
Another question is, one overarching theme is that distributions of many of the species you talked about are changing. Any thoughts on the drivers behind those changes? Is there some common drivers among all the species that might underlie the changes? Is it food resource changing, human changes in land use, climate? You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, all of that, right? I mean, it's not one silver bullet, unfortunately, and that's why sort of long-term monitoring and then paired with these types of projects that allow you some real critical insights. The reality is sometimes it gets blurred about this, like, well, the changes are only negative. Well, I wouldn't pose it that way. Snow geese and swans are living high on the hog. They are probably at population sizes they've never been at. And that's solely because they don't have the native foods that they actually would be constrained by. They're having the supplemental food that's out there in the form of waste potatoes right now, right? Skagit, I mean, some of the waste potato fields up there right now is just mind-boggling. That is so much food that, it doesn't, there's so much food to carry over those birds. It's crazy. On the flip side, birds that are more reliant on those seasonal ephemeral wetland type of habitats, whether you're talking about brood rearing in the late summer or a spring migration, man, that's one that can be influenced by a number of things. And some of that is just sort of mindsets about, is it okay to let areas flood? Some people don't want places to flood for very long, or they don't want the water to stand there very long. Well, long exposure water is very beneficial, not only for ducks, but things like shorebirds. So trying to balance, find those sort of like opportunities to impact those habitats that maybe are viewed as problematic or not influenced directly by us as a either state or federal agency. That's going to be a big important topic going forward. And that is exactly why we've started to revisit some of those projects that we had information that was good enough for us to kind of make more informed decisions. But now there's a whole host of other things like crashing herring spawn up in Cherry Point, or shifts of dairy quota to the east side, driving food availability to the east side. And what follows food? Birds, right? So why do we see more snow geese on the east side of the state? Food. There's more corn being grown on the east side of the state than there's ever been before. So all of that in the background of like what can grow, when are farmers getting in there? Are they disking at times that are negative to nesting, but maybe not, maybe being influenced by when rainfall patterns happen? Yep, that's all going on. And so while I use waterfowl, I guess the one thing I'll kind of clarify there is while I use waterfowl to paint that issue statement with regards to some of the wetland types, I keep mentioning the seasonal ephemeral wetland. Sandhill cranes coming back through the springtime. Yeah, ephemeral wetlands are kind of what they have to have. And so if there is not seasonal ephemeral wetlands on the east side of the state in the springtime, then you don't have a lot of sandhill crane habitat out there. And so it's, while I use harvestable species that I have that obligation over, the intent is to influence that sort of wetland habitat world out there, not just for waterfowl, but for that whole migratory sort of concept. So
What about the swan banding currently underway? And I should note that Martha asked this question.
Yeah, Martha knows. Martha's been grinding that out with the graduate student. Yeah, we're trying. We're trying to mark some trumpeter swans with similar fancy transmitters to get that better habitat use. It's been quite the year with sort of the wonkiness of just sort of weather and birds probably being a little bit further north than in most years, and then just trying to find the spot on the ground that we can do the captures. And so yeah, there will be that project still working out the kinks, as Martha knows, but we hope to have some pretty, there is one marked swan with one of those fancy transmitters online right now, but and that data is incredible, but we're hoping to get up to about 24 of them. So the students grinding and learning how hard some of these capture efforts can be. So we're getting there.
How can we in Edmonds get a handle on the importance of the Edmonds Marsh to these waterfowl?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, and that's one of those where it's like, well, yeah, you're sort of what you want to show matters, right? So, for example, if you mark preseason, like what I'm saying, the duck banding, right? Through harvest recovery, or if you put some fancy marker on, you're going to see, well, where is this resident, locally nesting bird with brood, possibly with broods? Where did they wind up come the fall, winter, spring time? And while a lot of people think mallards and Canada geese stay real local, not that local. That one female mallard that the Stillaguamish marked, she's made multiple trips up the Fraser Valley and up to Whatcom and back, and she's visited all 4 of the bays. Like, she is constantly moving around, kind of hunting out what the sort of where is the food. So that sort of viewing it as a starting point, what are your birds that are most reliant as a starting point? There are some new technique, new tracking techniques like MODIS. MODIS doesn't get you habitat use, but it certainly gets you attendance, and it gets you attendance as far as the network of sites that are online are able to tell you. And so these tags that they're coming out with are much smaller, but it would leave a cookie crumb trail of like, what tower did the bird visit? So if you have a very migratory species, you might very well get some pings from much further down the flyway. But so that's sort of these like connectivity ways. But if you're wanting to know, like, yeah, this sort of what is the value of that marsh, that's where you have to kind of saddle the counts and movement together, and that's possible. But it's just one of those, like, the level of effort, the amount of capacity of either volunteers and staff to pull off something like that, and sort of the how fine scale versus that broad conversation, broader sort of like zone of is it really population, or are we talking about individuals? That's always a balancing act with every one of these marking projects that I have described. That's always the first initial step, is what is the question that we're actually trying to answer, and what's our best ability to either use marking to our advantage, or is there some other method that might be helpful like alongside, or just maybe more appropriate because of sort of the scale. And so, duck banding is an easy start, just to kind of get folks realizing like, hey, this is a big deal. But yeah, happy to talk about that more if there's that type of interest. I should point out just recently, actually on Monday, I think it was, there was a meeting with Puget Sound Bird Observatory related to some of the secretive marsh secretive bird surveys that they do, and kind of the future thinking about that, right? And I was invited to be part of that, discussion, which is great. But it was very similar questions. Like, what is the fundamental question that we're trying to get at? Is it sort of, you're just trying to say something about this site of interest? Are you trying to plug this site into sort of the broader network of sites that are important to migratory birds? I don't know if that answered it. Might not have answered it, but we could figure out a way to make what your interest is useful.
And then another question is, is all the Salish data being fed into NOAA's environmental sensitivity index for Puget Sound? For example, oil spill prep.
Yeah, I'm reluctant to say all at this very moment. We do put all of that spatial data into sort of centralized databases that most of the bird marking community has agreed on, and that's referred to as MoveBank. MoveBank is sort of this all-encompassing database for marking data. It's always this game, particularly in Washington, it's this game about authorities across the sister state agencies, right? So part of my push, I guess I'll say, is trying to work with Department of Ecology, who has the authority over wetlands, Department of Natural Resources, who has the authority over more of the open water areas than what we do as a Department of Fish and Wildlife. We think about the critters, but we don't have necessarily the authority over the space. And then getting those folks to work with their NOAA contacts to kind of point it that direction. I've worked with some of these oil spill response teams to feed it into like the DNR response protocols, or the Department of Ecology and DNR response protocols. We haven't gotten there with the telemetry data, but those big aerial surveys that I mentioned have been ongoing since '94, and we put that in as part of the Puget Sound update, sort of the state of the Puget Sound type update. So we're doing our best to get it there, but it's sort of the right contexts are always sometimes interesting to try to chase down. So if you have someone that you think should be receiving that type of information, please reach out, because I'd be happy to point that in the right direction for those types of applications, because that's certainly why we've been adamant about having spatially explicit components of our data, right? We could just do counts, but you don't have to tie counts to places on the landscape, but to know sort of status and trends, unless you're trying to influence the spot on the ground, right? And so that's always been sort of a key priority, is anything that we collect, even if it's just counts, has a spatial component so that we can log it back into a spot on the map. And this is a perfect example of where that might influence. So happy, if you have contacts, please send them my way. I'm happy to get it there.
And then looks like a number of people are saying great presentation, thank you. And then lastly, Martha Jordan just made a comment that she's on the waterfowl advisory group for DFW, and if anybody has concerns or wants to talk about waterfowl, feel free to contact her. She'd love to hear the conservation side of waterfowl.
Yep, and just to point that, Waterfowl Advisory Group is appointed by the director. Of course, I solicit proposals, and it was strong emphasis to get someone tied to the other side of the waterfowl equation in on that group. That's been a request of the group for a long time. It just has not actually been solidified. So an exciting advancement there. So yes, please use Martha as a resource to share that type of information, and Martha and I are pretty regularly in contact. So the information will get to me one way or the other.
And yeah, I think that's all I see in the chat. So yeah,
Right.
just want to thank you again, Kyle, for this really informative and kind of eye-opening presentation for a lot of us. So thank you for your time tonight.
No problem, anytime, and hopefully we could do it in person for real next time. Happy to chat further, or if there's follow-up questions, like I said, just feel free to reach out. And yeah, I'm here as a resource to anybody that has interest in waterfowl and the other migratory game birds or influencing wetland habitats. So don't hesitate.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kyle.